There was a Scotsman, McGill, who used to watch birds on the rill, but he would have nothing to do with the puffin, for look at the size of its bill. And I think one of the most familiar scenes to people that don't know anything about birds is the picture of a puffin with that marvelous bill and with several fish in it. And this puffin has been out foraging, but it's not been out foraging for itself. It is coming back because it's been foraging to bring back food for a chick in the burrow. And this picture was probably taken when it's landed and about to go into the burrow to feed its chicks. And this is an aspect of foraging which we call central place foraging, where the object is bringing back food to a particular place. And this is true of birds with nestling. And if you watch bees out foraging or gathering all that pollen, they're not feeding themselves, they're bringing it back to the hive. And so I'll come back to that issue of central place foraging because it's a rather interesting one. But before I do, I want to leave you with a question. How does the puffin get second and third fish without dropping the fish it already had? And I will provide the answer later, but I'm going to leave it there for the moment, and you can figure it out. And we'll see if you get it, but we'll come back to it because this is here for a particular reason. Getting enough food to survive and be able to gather enough to reproduce is one of the fundamental things that all organisms have to do. And so as a behavioral ecologist is one of the things that I've been particularly interested in. And I was teaching my advanced ecology class, and I realized I hadn't really done anything about this, trying to figure out what does foraging theory look like, how would you do it? And I made an effort and worked hard on it and came and gave a lecture to my class. And at the end of the lecture, there was a graduate student from another department sitting in the back. And he came down to the front and said, "Gordon, that was terrible." At that point, I was confronted with an inconvenient truth. He was correct. And so I said, okay, let's do better. So he and I and another graduate student from a different department met once a week, working on and developed some stuff on foraging theory. They developed theses, and some of my publications that are still most cited are about that. So I bring personal experience to this as to how hard it was to do this. It wasn't that I was just stupid. At least I prefer that not to be the explanation, but it's genuinely hard. And I sort of feel my talk was probably like a cartoon I saw, because if Newton had been a botanist, and this botanist sitting on the tree and the apple falls on his head, and he says, "Aha, apples are not firmly attached to the tree." Absolutely true, absolutely uninformative. And we all talk about following the facts. The truth is there's an awful lot of facts that aren't worth following. And part of science and training is figure out which ones are worth following. So I'm going to try to do this with respect to foraging theory and developing it. But a first sidestep, how do you do evolutionary testing? We're talking about how this got molded. We're not talking about the future. We're trying to explain the past. What are the processes that led to this thing? Why did we have that as opposed to something else? What were the mechanisms? So we're talking about things that already have happened. And so George Gaylord Simpson, one of the great paleontologists of the last century, said, let's call this post-diction. Not prediction, post-diction, because it's already happened. We're not predicting the future. And almost all testing of evolutionary hypotheses is, in fact, post-diction. We're trying to understand the past. What are the processes why do we have this? Why does the world look like that? And that's the goal of evolutionary biology, to try to understand. And Darwin just, you go to Darwin, well, why do we have a puffin? And Darwin would say, I don't have a clue. I've given you a mechanism, you figure out what it means. And it's like the rabbi who said he could do the entire Torah standing on one foot. He said, it's the golden rule. Everything else is explication. So we're talking about dealing with testing with evolutionary hypotheses. This is a rather curious and different sort of thing than a lot of testing. And I want to show how this works and explain it to you. But remember that we're post-dicting. It's already happened. We're trying to understand what happened. And so that's the sleuthing. And it's hard. And there's a lot of ways to get misled, and a lot of facts that aren't worth following that we follow up anyway before we figure it out. When I train graduate students, one of the big things I try to get them to figure out is how to know which facts are worth following and which aren't. That's a part of evolution, of development of the scientific mind. And it isn't easy. But before I get into actually testing, I want to have one other diversion, which was really important in figuring out how to think about this. And let's imagine there's a lion, and she's going out hunting at night. And it's a she because the females do all the hunting. The males just roar. And, and so the female's out there, and she encounters a warthog. Now, lions, they do attack and eat warthogs. And warthog chops are tasty. But warthog is kind of small. And she's got kittens back there. And there are zebras and wildebeest out there, which are far preferable. And so the lion has to, do I go for this, try to attack this warthog, or do I wait with hope of finding a zebra or a wildebeest, which would be much, much better? How could she make that decision? What would she have to know even to think about that decision? And if the lion comes to you and asks for advice, what would you have to know to tell her something, you know? And so this really turns out to be interesting. And one of the things that it took us a while to figure this out is that any forager, and the female lion in this case, is a Bayesian statistician. And you may not know anything about Bayesian statistics, and that's fine. You don't need to know anything about it. But the point is that in order for her to make a decision, she has to have some sense of what the world is out there. She has to have some. If I don't go and I wait for a zebra or a wildebeest, and I don't find one, I come back with nothing. What's the probability if I let the warthog go and wait for a wildebeest or a zebra? What's the probability that I would find one? How long would I have to? Because if I don't go for that and wait, I come back in the morning with nothing. So the idea of Bayesian statistics is that for any organism, and the good news I'm going to tell you, and don't try this on a cocktail party, but it's good news, you are all Bayesian statisticians. Don't try it on anybody else, but you are. Okay, because we all do, and every morning we update our priors. I have to do mine every morning now. But anyway, so she has to come with some prior knowledge about what the state of the environment is. And so what a Bayesian statistics involves, that the organism has some sense. This is what it's bringing as the understanding to the situation. And then it gets updated. And so the real question then to the female lion is, what should she do? Oh, I saw a zebra last night, or did I? Or the night before? What sort of background information would I have to bring to this to bear? How long of a background set of information should I even try to use? And this turns out to be assessing what the priors are, an important part of evolutionary biology, because if the background is pretty predictable, That's one sort of thing. If it's really an uncertain environment, how long do you wait and what do you use? This turns out to be an exciting part of the development of this sort of theory. But so I just wanted to mention at the beginning because Bayesian statistics is going to rear its ugly head throughout my talk. And this is important to know that we can't do any thinking about foraging theory and what organisms ought to do without giving the organism some knowledge, some sense of what the environment is at the moment that it may update. And this is actually what turns out to be testable. So remember that priors, the organism has a certain sense of what the environment is like based on whatever information we think it ought to be there, and it would have been molded by natural selection. But that's a part of the operation, and so that's a background for everything. And Bayesian statistics is going to keep cropping up throughout my talk. So let's go back to actually how we test. So if you're going to test some evolutionary theory, you have to have a guess of what natural selection might have favored. And the first guess, which was an obvious one, and it's turned out to be very good, was natural selection would favor when an organism is foraging that it maximizes the amount of energy it gets per unit time. That's a guess on them. And that's a good guess because foraging is time exclusive. If you're out foraging, you can't do anything else, and the other things to use time for. We also know from everybody who's ever studied birds that there are runts in the nest, and you say, that young one ain't going to make it as skinny, and that isn't going to be on the breeding population next year. If they had brought more energy, they might have kept that kid going. So we know that this is a shortage. So getting enough energy per unit time is probably something that natural selection ought to have favored. How do we figure that out, whether that was the case or not? So the way you set this up, and it's sort of crazy. Let's say then we get an array of all the particular prey items that this forager might have looked at, and we look at each one and say and rank it. What is the energy expected if you go for it for the time it takes before you're ready to hunt again? So this is the energy per unit time. And we rank all the prey from the top to the bottom out there. And so we have an array. And we confront the organism. And the answer is rather interesting. The diet is expanded or contracted at the bottom, depending entirely on the abundance of the most favored species. And put simply, if the best item in terms of energy per unit time is really common, it doesn't pay to take anything else. You wait, another one's going to come really fast, and you're going to get your energy maximized by then. But if then say that prey gets less abundant, well, you add something else, and you keep adding. And you add and subtract down, and it's based entirely on the abundance of higher ranked organisms. And that turns out, if you want to maximize it, that's the case. But so let's go imagine this forager out there, and we've given it perfect knowledge about this. It knows what all those prey are and what their value is, and it knows how much time each one takes and all of that. Well, no organism knows that. And you can't ask the organisms to go figure that out. It would take forever, and you'd starve in the process of trying to figure it out. So organism can't operate knowing that. But why do you do something so stupid like giving it all that free knowledge? Because you want to find out what would it do if that were true. And you can see how close it gets to it. And that idea has been tested, and it's been tested ingeniously with a bird called the great tit. And the word tit has a different connotation in Britain than it does here. And it was done interesting. You had a conveyor belt, and you could put different, and these are mealworms or pieces of mealworms, and they knew how long it took when a great tit went and picked up a mealworm and swallowed when it was ready to hunt again. So we knew this for each of the things. And so the conveyor belt was coming. And the great tit would start with no priors at all. It didn't have any idea what was coming. But what turns out that they rather quickly figured this out. and that if the big mealworm, and the mealworms are beetle larvae, as you probably know, follower beetle larvae, and they're really good. Birds love them, they figured out very quickly what the abundance was, and adjusted their diet because they started out sort of picking up everything. But rather quickly they figured this out, and adjusted as though they were obeying the rule, maximize the amount of energy you can get per unit time. And they did pretty well, even though they couldn't possibly have had the perfect knowledge we said they had. But so what this has led to is a lot of understanding. It really works. They figure it out pretty fast, but they can't be doing what we said they're doing with perfect knowledge because we know they don't have that. So you end up, how close would different rules of thumb get you to it? So they start developing models for if you different rules of thumb, how close do you get? So what might organisms that don't have this complete knowledge that we've given to them free, what will they do? And this turns out to be rather interesting as to how close you can get with different rules of thumb. So this turns out to be an important part of foraging theory. So the bottom line here is that we can set up models that they can be tested as possible to figure out, and it looks like the idea that birds are trying to maximize the amount of energy they get per time foraging looks to be a pretty good predictor of how they behave, and they do the best with this sort of thing. So this is just one example. It was a rather ingenious test, and the birds did better than I thought they would. But I've always felt, birds are pretty good at being birds. And when someone tells you you're a bird brain, take it as a compliment, because so that's one test. But let's continue with this a little bit. The bird there is doing this, and things are getting worse. Maybe it's depleted the prey or something like this. Well, there's other places in the world out there. Should it move to try to find some other place that may be better? And again, we're confronted with the Bayesian statistical problem. It has to have some idea what the world is like out there, what other patches. If it leaves the patches in and goes to another patch, how likely is it to find another patch? And so again, we have the organism, in order to make any decision, should I leave the patch I'm in now and go somewhere else? It has to have some prior estimate of what the world is like out there. Because I'm going to leave my passion and there ain't nothing out there. That's not such a good thing. Stick with it even though it ain't so good anymore. So we start looking at the real world out there, which is a patchy environment. And if things are getting bad where you are, you don't have to stay where you are. But how would you decide when to leave where you are? What's the likelihood you're going to find another patch? And again, the bird or any forager has to have in its mind some sense. This is what the environment is like out there now. This is the probability that I will find something better if I move. And again, it's operating with Bayesian statistics. It can't make a decision about whether to move or not without having some prior assessment of what the world is like out there. So in all of these foraging things, and I told you it's going to keep cropping up, it's impossible to even make models and to think about organisms make these decisions without the organism have some sense about what the environment is out there. And this can be, in the case of the great tips of the thing, no priors, immediate adjustment. But in reality, there's going to be evolutionary adjustments. And there's going to be adjustment based on what the experience of the organism has been in the environment recently. It has updated, and it's got a sense. In my experience, this is what the environment is like now. this is how likely, if I don't go after the warthog, I'm going to get a zebra. So you can't think about foraging theory without giving the organism having some sense of what the environment's like. And if I do this, what's the chance that I improve my situation than if I don't do it? And figuring out what the priors are, and basically if the environment is pretty stable, the period of time that did I see a zebra last week or yesterday? But if it's very, very uncertain, the length of time over which the organism might be integrating, and figuring out what the priors and how you set the priors turns out to be an interesting part of foraging theory, which I'm not going to go into now because it leads us into the weeds. But you get the idea as to why you can't make any theory or test anything unless the organisms are operating with some prior assessment of what the world is like at the moment it's having to make a decision. And it gets, and they can be updated pretty fast, as the great TIS did. They're really amazingly fast. They figured this out. It may not be easy so fast, but that's the fundamental thing, and it turns out to make any kind of predictions or any sort of tests, we have to give the organism some prior assessment. This is what it thinks about the environment that it's in now, and what happens if I do this or that. So that's why it turns out it took us a while to figure this out, that the organisms had to be Bayesian statisticians. And in order to do anything, you had to allow it to do some stuff. So and that goes on to a lot of other things there. Let's leave that one and come back to our puffin. Okay? And I left you with a question. So the puffin, this is an example of what we call central place foraging. As I mentioned, this is a different thing, and it's interesting because the unit in central place foraging is a round trip, right? There's the trip out, there's the foraging part and the trip back, and food is gathered only in one of the three phases. No food is gathered on the trip out and the trip back. So, we're going out. And one of the things that is immediately obvious qualitatively, you don't need any advanced mathematical knowledge. Closer is better. The closer you can find the prey, the shorter the trip, the better it's going to be. And so we see this a lot in the location of colonies of breeding seabirds where you're packed right in there. And one of the places, they're almost always where there's a strong current. And it brings new prey all the time. You cannot deplete it because the water mass tomorrow is not the water mass you had today. And so if you look at the location of where big seabird colonies are, that is often one of there's a strong current, which means the water you're sampling tomorrow is not the water you looked at today. And so you can't really deplete it. Another way that happens, like the murres that are common on the coast here in the big colonies, the little ones, when they're still kind of pretty tiny, they jump off the cliff into the water. The adult takes them, off they go with the adult, and they take the prey with them, so there's no round trip anymore. They can move and do that. And that's, but one other solution to this is to, how do we maximize what I can get during that foraging period? Okay. Now, if we have a long, thin bill, like a tern, the first prey you get, that's it. You can't put that anywhere and get another one. And so then the tern out there, which has a long, thin bill, then it's just like we've been talking about. What is that like when I look at, this is the first fish, am I going to get a bigger one? Because I know the first one I take is going to be it. I can't add anything to it. So then it becomes just like we've been talking about. What's the assessment out there? If there's a fish, okay, what's the likelihood if I don't go after it, I get a bigger fish? Because fish number one stops it. And whenever I get the first fish, I got to come back with it. But obviously, that's not the problem that the puffin has. And that's the secret of that bill. You have that fat bill. It's possible, and the mechanics have been worked out. You can put something back there, and you can still get something else. And this tells you it works. You know, the puffin has in fact done it. And so what determines the limit? And it's probably the likelihood, if you got two already, it may be more difficult to hold two and get the third. So the likelihood that, oh, I should have quit because now I dropped them all, you know, sort of thing, means that the evolution of this bill, this fat bill, it allows you, and the mechanics have been worked out, to in fact stuff one back and catch something and not lose that one. And that's what the puffin bill is all about. And all the fancy stuff we see, given a big bill like that, that's great to use it as a display, show it off. And that's what the puffin does with this. But you should look at what the puffin looks like in the fall and the winter. You wouldn't recognize any of this. And if you haven't ever looked at, I've got one here with the page marked what the puffin looks like in the non-breeding season. But you probably have a bird guide, and if you're interested, go look it up. You won't recognize it. It doesn't look like a puffin. It's got a kind of funny thing there, but nothing like this. So it has taken it. Bills can be changed a lot and all sorts of stuff done. And this bill undergoes amazing transformation as breeding season comes down. It does, and we also know you can do that with feathers, right? You can change the feathers. That's a big deal. But you can also do it with bills. And there's a lot of changing in colors and shapes of bills. And if you look at the other alcids, the oxmers and puffins, a lot of them do things with their bills in the breeding season. We got one out here called the rhinoceros auklet. What happens? In the breeding season, it does a big thing on the bill. That's why it's called rhinoceros. That's not on the bill in the fall and the winter. And if you look at other alcids, you see that a lot is done. And even if you watch the gulls out here now, they're coming into breeding plumage. And one of the things that we'll see that happen if you look closely, they develop a bright red patch at the tip of the bill. It's not there now. You'll see it in the spring. And that's the little thing that the chicks peck at. That's the guide to the first chick. The chicks peck at it. But that's a color that they pick up in the spring, in the breeding season, and then they drop it. So birds' bills are pretty fascinating. And there's a lot you can do with the bill. This is the most spectacular thing you can do with the bill, which is why I chose it and why you all know that puffin bill. There's almost nobody that doesn't know what a puffin looks like in the spring because it's such a wonderful thing. But this is a bill. Then it enhances in the spring. They do also stuff with it, and it's a courtship device and other things. But the reason the puffin had that to do with natural selection was favoring a fat bill. You can stuff one or two back there and still get the third. And that's what this is all about. Another way they can stop it, some of the bigger birds, you eat it and come back and regurgitate it. And that's then how big a gut have you got to. But then there's also a limit. You're storing it there and it's hot. You start digesting it. Right? If you take too long, there ain't much value left anymore because you've digested it. And so this can set a limit for things that are going to come back and regurgitate. That sets the time of how long you ought to go out there. So looking at central place foraging and how you maximize what you get during that one phase that you're getting food. Turns out to be really interesting, and it has implications for what the changes in breeding plumage is, the structure of the bills, where bird colonies are, all of that stuff. That's all related. And again, it seems to be based upon following the notion that maximizing the amount of energy you can get in unit time of foraging is what's driving it. And this seems to be working so well generally because energy is critical, and foraging, you can't do anything when you're out hunting. You can't do anything else. I mean, the time is just simply not shareable. So that's an important part of understanding this. So we've made an awful lot of mileage by understanding, just using one predictor, namely energy maximization while foraging. And that turns out to have but that's not everything. And let me just give you one diversion here that will emphasize how different it can be. I've been talking about animals that are eating other animals. But there's a lot of animals that eat plants. Okay? And the question is not to pursue or not, but to bite or not. Okay? And this is also interesting because when you look about animals eating plants, which a lot of animals do, I haven't talked about, but we've got to have some optimal foraging for them too, right? And it's also very interesting because mostly they're very tiny, the insects are tiny. Very seldom does the prey get killed. It survives. And it can do things to get tougher. And we have what goes on with that is the plants develop defensive chemistry, and it can, different sort of kinds, and it can be changed. And plants, when they've been attacked, are able to change and up the defensive in other parts of the plant because the herbivore isn't going to be killing you. You've got a chance to do something on the other branch because it hasn't been attacked yet. And this is my basic belief that all the origin of so-called talking trees and everything else, they're not talking to different trees, they're talking to different parts of where they are. That's a long story, but we'll leave that one for later. But there's a great big area of foraging theory that I haven't talked about, and that is animals eating plants. And here's an interesting evolutionary quirk, a story. Animals evolved very complicated systems in the ocean. And if we look at how the period of geological history when everything was in the sea, it's all called zoic animals, right? Because what you have in the fossils are animal remains. There's no plant remains. Why? Because all the plants there were simple algae, simple little cells that didn't do anything. And even the great kelp that we got there, that's just a chain of individual cells, each of which is self-sufficient, bathed, and there's no conducting system, there's no roots, there's nothing like that in those. Each cell is an individual thing that gets everything it wants. And when the photosynthetic organisms that were mostly very, very simple in the ocean, every cell was bathed in everything it needed. It got everything from its immediate environment. So when plants colonized the land, they started with nothing. And so everything that plants have built on land has been built after they got to land. And the fact that now the plant is confronted with gravity, which it wasn't a problem before in the water, is also the fact that it's got to get resources in different. Now it gets some resources, carbon dioxide and sunlight from the air. All the other stuff, the water and all the nutrients, it gets from the soil. So it's got to develop all of this. And so plants have developed a very complicated chemistry for all of this. But one of the things as it developed all of this, it didn't pick up any use of sodium, no salt, because salt is scarce on land. So we look at the basis for all the chemistry. Sodium isn't involved. Now, animals evolve their nervous system in the ocean, which happens to have a lot of sodium. And the basis of the way the nervous system is functions in animals is a sodium pump. If you learned anything about physiology, you learn about the sodium pump. So animals need sodium, and we picked up almost certainly sodium was involved in because it evolved in a very sodium-rich environment. There's sodium all over the place. So then animals come on land, and we're already very complicated, but we brought our marine evolved nervous system that wants sodium, needs sodium. Plants don't need sodium. They don't have it. And I'll just leave it with you, one of the most striking things about human history is the power and the role for looking for salt. And Michael Kurlansky's wonderful book just called Salt. And there's another companion one just called Cod. But salt has had an absolutely amazing role in human history. And why is it so important? Why do we fight wars over salt and everything? Because we need salt, and particularly if you're an herbivore, getting salt is a real problem. If you want to catch a deer, and I put up a salt lick and sit, they're going to come. And so it turns out that getting enough salt turns out to be a big problem for herbivores. And they crave it and do also. You see the moose going to that water in the summer? That's awful stuff. It's all watery. You wouldn't want to eat that. That's really bad. But some of those platycans have salt. The moose going into the water there is picking up its annual supply of sodium. Because the other stuff it's going to eat doesn't have any sodium. The moose is going to be in big trouble. So as we talk about animals that eat plants, it turns out that chemistry turns out to be an enormous thing. And because of the evolutionary history of our nervous system, salt is an amazing thing. We fight wars over it and we do all this stuff. And I've tried to explain to you there's a little interesting evolutionary history of why salt is so important and why we fight wars over it and all these sorts of things. So that's a little diversion into the fact that I talked about foraging theory. Well, there was a huge area of foraging theory, animals eating plants, that I didn't touch at all. And I've given you just a little sampling to show how different that world is. It's totally different. And we're into biochemistry and all sorts of stuff, into plants' defensive chemistry, because once the lion catches the zebra, there's no chance to make any evolutionary or metabolic adjustment. The plant can up its defenses, and they do. So this is an entirely different world, and it's an exciting world. But when we talk about that aspect of foraging theory, it's really quite different. And that's another set of talks, very different. I won't go any further, but to let you know that, again, the whole point of this is for any theory, you have to know what's the domain of applicability. How much does it apply for? The central place foraging theory has a limited application. It's when birds are going out, when insects are going, whenever you're coming back and storing and taking back to a central place. That's a rather limited part of nature. It happens to be one that we were really interested in, and we did a lot with it, but it's narrow application. So it's always important to know what is the zone of applicability of any theory. And for foraging theory, we don't have the foraging theory of everything, and we never will. And to think you might find that, don't do it, because it ain't there. But knowing what the domain of applicability is. So I've tried to explain to you that that looking at evolutionary explanations like I've given to you has some interesting quirks. And we're not trying to predict the future, we're in post-diction. And there was the quote, the hardest thing about the Soviet Union is to predict the past. Well, it turns out that one of the hardest things to predict about the United States is the past. But it's hard. We're trying to figure out the past now. We do all these models. And how natural selection would have worked to produce the kind of world we have. Why we have puffins that do this. Why we have lions that chase zebras and behave that way. We're trying to explain it, and the answer is in the past, and we're trying to guess the past, and this is post-diction. It gives these evolutionary hypotheses an interesting, it's still basic science, but you got to remember, it's somewhat different than asking, what's carbon dioxide going to do to the climate, which is a very, very different sort of question and a different way of looking at it. So understanding what post-diction and what this is like is really an important thing to get the difference. And I hope I've given you some understanding of that. So I hope with this I've given you some ability to understand how you do evolutionary hypothesis testing and why it's got quirks. Why the good news is you're all Bayesian statisticians, and even though you didn't know it, and why the zone of applicability is important. So I hope I've conveyed some of these to you. But the most important thing of all that I hope you remember, above all, I hope you'll never look at a puffin again the same way. And enjoy lunch.
Bill, Augusta, and I will handle questions. There's a couple over there, Bill.
So the reason the puffin has fish in its bill is because it's looking for salt?
No.
As
No.
opposed to not having a bill full of grass?
No,
Well, why does it eat fish and not grass?
because it feeds on the ocean and there's no grass in the ocean.
Okay.
But again, it's important to know that all plant development is on land. There was nothing but simple algae when plants invaded. Animals invaded the land as lobsters and crayfish and all this sort of stuff. So the conquest of the land has been dramatically different for plants and animals. And it has profound implications for how we see the two. But the things that feed it, the puffin is getting all sorts of, it doesn't have to worry about salt. It's getting all the salt it needs in its fish, because the fish are full of salt. So any marine organism that's fishing doesn't have to worry about salt. The only organisms that have to worry about salt are terrestrial predators, terrestrial animals that are eating plants. That's where the salt comes from.
Go ahead.
Gordon,
Yes,
not quite sure I know how to ask this question.
give it a try.
You talked about the birds and the predators needing some knowledge or appreciation in order to make a decision about maybe to move to another location.
Yes.
And I don't know the terminology, but my question is this. Is it genetic programming based on evolutionary experience that gets built in? I have a friend, for example, who likes to argue that the reason we don't have free will is because we're all programmed on the basis of experience that we get passed down to us. So is the ability to make those choices coming from some sort of innate programming due to evolution?
That's a very good question, and the answer is all of the above. Well, I give you one example of the great tits with the bull. That's something they picked up right away, and are learning really fast. But a lot of the programming will be based on what natural selection has favored in the past. You know, if an organism is living in a highly variable environment, natural selection will have probably favored its sense of awareness and what it needs to look at. They've been molded by selection, and the fact that the environment is highly variable over time, and it's a lot harder to do it. If it's a highly predictable environment, the priors are likely to be evolved to be much simpler. So what turns out, it's a very interesting question, and a lot of evolutionary thinking is about this. How do the priors evolve, and what's going on with those? Because it is some combination. Because what we've seen that is involved, organism is having to modify its prior, so that's an instantaneous thing. It's got some prior. This is what I think the environment is. I've just got some new information. I readjust. So that's an immediate, and it's a learning. So that's an important part about this, but what it is bringing in the way of prior understanding is likely to have a long genetic and evolutionary component. So it's an interesting mix, but the updating of the priors was going on all the time. That's learning. That's really fast. And without which, I mean, the organism's got to be able to update its priors or it doesn't get anywhere. And genes aren't any good for that. They can't. You can't use the genes. This has got to be something that the organism's nervous system allows it to learn that right at the moment. But the background priors were probably laid down by evolution over long, long periods of time. Does that answer your question? Yes. Okay. Yes.
I have a guess about the puffin, but I'm also wondering why the lion doesn't just go ahead and kill the warthog and stay there, wait to see if they can then get a better kill with a zebra.
That's a good question. But one of the things that if it goes after the warthog, and it gets it, but the value, the prior is also, what's the chance that it gets, when a lion goes after a warthog, it doesn't get him all the time. You know, so, but if you do get it, you're onto it. But in the process of doing that chasing and stuff like that, you've alerted everybody else in the area there's a lion there. And so so much of that sort of predatory stuff depends upon stealth. If you go after the warthog, you've given it away. You can't go with the naive prey anymore. They know you're there. They've heard you. They've watched you.
I have a question. How does the puffin distribute those fish one at a time or just dump it all? Will the bill hold them back?
Well, when the puffin gets to the nest, it goes, puffins are in a burrow. They'll have the chicks in a burrow. And when the chicks are young, it has to feed each one individually because the babies can't grab anything. When they really get older, they can just dump it and the babies can pick it up. So it depends upon the age of the babies.
So the bill can hold the fish and distribute one at a time.
They can give them one at a time, or they can dump it. And which they do depends on how old the chicks are. Yeah.
So following up on the second best, this is just a question of fact. If you're a one-fish bird, like you were talking about, do you get some little fish, do you ever drop them and go after a big one?
That's a very good question, and that might be a smart thing to do. I don't know. And I don't know if anybody knows this, because that's happening out at sea. And I'm not aware of any observation where people said, I was watching this tern coming back with a fish, and it dropped it and went for another one,
Right.
which might be a smart thing to do. I don't know if it happens.
So I have another question.
Okay.
Presumably, people are interested in maximizing the mean of the energy. Does the variance ever come into it?
Yeah, well, the variance comes in terms of how you establish your priors. The variance is related when you're trying to assess what do I do and how variable the mean isn't. Well, if you don't know anything and you can't understand anything, you go for the mean, okay?
Right.
But organisms can do better than the mean by getting some additional information. So one way you can look at, related to your question, what I talked about, what do organisms do to do better than the mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's like when you play blackjack, you count the deck,
Yeah.
and then when it's a favorable thing, then you
Yeah.
put your money down.
Yeah. But it's I think in many ways a battle to do better than the mean. But that's one way we could frame it. Yeah.
Gordon, thank you very much. I watched the crows in Lake Forest Park where we've lived for years, and watching them decide whether or not they're going to eat our fruit out of the yard or other items. The next generation seemed to have the same knowledge as the previous one, and even though they might not have had the experience of our plastic owl, and the UW has done a lot of research, I think, on bird behavior, why the second generation is able to recognize almost facial recognition, even which was learned by the previous generation.
Well, there's a combination. What we're talking about is a combination of what you pick up as you're living, your priors, how you're updating and learning about the world and getting a different sense of it just based on your experience, which in the case of highly social organism may also be based on the experience of what you learn from other individuals around you. And birds learn a lot, for example, from other birds. And for primates, we're highly social. So much of what you learn about the world and what you think it is social learning. In a lot of organisms, there won't be any of that. There isn't any so it's all genetic. But there's learning, updating of priors is always learning. That's what it is, because and if you don't have the ability to learn, you can't do much about it. Then you're stuck with the averages if you can't learn. But a lot of, and particularly in highly social animals, which includes us, so much of learning and the updating of priors and what you think the world is like is what other people are telling you it's like, and that turns out to be and one of the best ways to learn about an unpredictable environment is look at the individuals around you that have survived. They've made it. They must know something. Let's pay attention to them.
Back to you, Gordon.
Okay.
So you mentioned that. Okay, you mentioned that we should look at the non-breeding puffin and its bill. So I did that just while you were talking, and it's certainly a less colorful bill, like you mentioned with the gulls. But is it mechanically different when it's feeding only itself?
No. The mechanical stuff is still there. All of this is social stimulation, breeding, competing fluff. But the mechanics are that you looked at, and that's a very good question, a very good observation. That the mechanic, all of this doesn't affect the fundamental structure of the bill, and so, but during the non-breeding season, it doesn't need that. It's out there. It's not doing central place foraging. It's not of much use during the non-breeding season. But all the fluff isn't of any use in the non-breeding season either. So all of this is relating to that. But the mechanics are still there. The puffin could do that in the non-breeding season, but it's never doing central place foraging then, so it doesn't matter.
Gordon, I have an example of, I'm here. I have an example that's not birds, but we have
That's not allowed.
I'm going to give it anyway. We have a problem with elevators here. And the question is it worthwhile to just stand and
Yep.
use your favorite elevator, or do you
Yep.
walk around and push the button
Yeah.
on every single one? And they're obviously techniques.
Every day you're being a Bayesian forager. You're doing exactly what I've described what Bayesian foraging is. And we all face it every day. Do we wait or go around? I mean, that's it. It's a wonderful example. And that's exactly what Bayesian statistics is about.
I have a question about scurvy and the early sailors.
Yes.
For years, they had gotten scurvy when they would be
Yeah.
sailing too long. And eventually, they found out by accident that if they ate some plants on an island that they came to, they wouldn't get scurvy. And that became well known among the sailors,
Yeah.
and they solved scurvy by eating green plants.
Well, my understanding.
So I wondered, can this operate by accident? Which is what my example is, I think.
Well, my understanding of the example of scurvy is it was vitamin C problem, and they solved it by taking limes and eating, and that's why the British sailors were called limeys. They picked up vitamin C from that, and that was one of the main successes for the British sailors. That when they didn't die like the others did, they figured that out. So, but it is again, it's a peculiar thing because when you get on the ship, everything is wrong. You know that there's a water everywhere and not a drop to drink. You know, because we can't we can drink salt water, but we lose more water trying to get rid of it because we can't make a urine more concentrated than seawater. The puffin knows how to do that, and in fact, if you look at it, it'll have a little gland right at the base of the bill, and it'll drop the salt out. And all the birds that have gone back to sea have come from the land. They got the same constitution we do. They have to deal with salt. And they drip it out, and you can see this on gulls too if you watch them. You can sometimes see the salt dripping out. Enough said about that. But anyway, it's when we get into unusual environments, we have to do unusual things. Yeah.
Do puffins have predators? Do puffins have predators? Because I would think that bright coloration would draw attention.
Yeah.
And that would be a reason why it would be seasonal.
Yeah, that's a very good question. That's almost certainly why puffins drop this. And when you're in the non-breeding season, they look pretty dull, and why an awful lot of birds do the same thing. They molt all those bright feathers they had in the spring. And birds find it easy to do this because you can do it with feathers and flip them around. And there's an awful lot of birds in August. You look around. Where are the male mallards? You're looking at them. They just look like females. They've lost all that. And so birds, that's one of the wonderful things about feathers. You can do all sorts of wonderful things with them. So almost certainly a lot of going into cryptic, and why the puffins don't look anything like this in the fall and winter is that if in a world with predators, that's not a good way to look. But it's worth it in the spring when you've got competition for this and that and can do stuff. And breeding season animals do some weird things.
getting back to the limeys, my understanding is that the plants were discovered first, but they were nasty tasting.
Oh,
And they
okay.
couldn't, and the sailors, they couldn't get the sailors to really use them.
Okay.
And then after that came the limes.
Okay.
And
Thank you. Thank you. I didn't know that, so good.
You want the last word?
Well, I hope, as I said, you'll never look at a puffin's bill again in the same way. And I earnestly don't put too much salt on your lunch.